So this discussion goes in three parts. One part is what's the general story of my farm. The second part has to do with the harvest that I've seen over the years. And the third part has to do with my local climate. At that point, it pulls into one beautiful picture, and that's the end of our 25-minute run. So the location for me is on the west side of Michigan. In the larger picture, our farm is where the gold star sits. Gold star because I made the map. It's important, first of all, to notice, I don't know how well it shows for you, but my farm sits on the edge of the lower portion of a broad river valley as the Grand River goes out to Lake Michigan to the left. And one of the consequences of that is that when spring frosts are happening or that cold spring weather, cold air is draining over a fairly large area toward our farm, so we're more frost inclined than a lot of areas near us. Let's see here. So initially, a lot of conversations went on with my nearest neighbors, and I could keep an eye on how their crops were working. And it became pretty obvious that what was happening with me and what was happening with them were two very different stories. So that was the beginning of trying to work through this puzzle. And one of the parts of the solution to this is that there's an automated weather station. That's the green marker down there, about 6 or 7 miles from my farm. Similar elevation, not too much difference in proximity to Lake Michigan. And it's quite representative of the conditions at my farm. And the good news is they've been taking data readings every hour or more for the last 20 years. So it gives me a good snapshot of the weather there. I promise it's not going to get any worse than this picture. The situation is that my crop is technically what they call zone 6. And that only tells us something about how cold it gets in the average winter, which has just been totally inadequate for describing my situation. So what I did is I adapted a form of a growing degree day plot used at a website called U2U, related to corn growing in the Midwest. And let's see if I can do the pointer here. There we go, there. So here we have growing degree days accumulating through the year, and this is really just the 20 years individually drawn. So you can see from year to year, or on any day of the year, there's a good deal of variation that could come along. So one of the candidates for issues was that variation. And the corn version of this, they showed the last frost of spring as a vertical bar. And if that last frost fell on a couple of days, or a couple of years fell on one day rather, they'd pile one bar on top of the other. So you get to get some sense of when the frosts are happening. So for me, this is the spring frost, and first frost of autumn is here. One other thing I've added for clarity on my part is on the average, I was wondering how many growing degree days are coming along every day through the year. You know, where is this warmth that you're using through the year? So I've added that as this line, which goes along with a chart over here. Let's see here. That's probably enough, although I do want to point out that if growing degree days are a mystery to you, I've got a couple of references that we'll include later in this presentation that talk about methods of calculating this. That's a good starting point. With farm history over the years, I started planting trees in 1990. I cycled through a 10-acre field over 4 years. And by 2000, those trees were starting to supply a few nuts. So I do have a harvest history that goes from roughly 2000 up to the present date. We'll get into more details on that in a slide or two. But that gives me a harvest history and a weather history. And things were running along on a fairly even keel, although I was adding a few trees, grafted cultivars or grafting trees I had, 2 more productive cultivars. But finally in 2020, the chestnut gall wasp showed up at my farm. And it's been multiplying like crazy. And finally this past year, it had a major impact on the crop that was produced. So my harvest record keeping is totally upset by this extra speed bump in the road of life out there. Okay, so here's the way the year works at my location, and I think this is not the way things work as you move further south, but I don't know how far south you have to go before things change. That growing degree information begins to accumulate as you get into April and May. So that's when the buds begin to turn just a little bit green. That's the first sign of growth I see. And if at some point over the next month we get a really hard frost, meaning enough frost to kill growth around 28 degrees, the leaves begin to turn a bit brown and crispy. And how much brown and how much crispy depends on how much growth has happened and just how cold it got. And the expectation is something's going wrong and might not be much of a crop that year. Now, every year for me, this blossom time falls real regularly within a few days. You know, you could take a cookie cutter and stamp it on the year. And then similarly for harvest season down here, different trees begin dropping nuts pretty much on the same day, within a couple of days. The more vague part of the program is this whole blossom business. Okay, so over the years, this is the history of harvest that I've gone through. And when we first started dealing with the public, we were recording every harvest that somebody brought in or we brought in, the tree, as long as we weren't getting overwhelmed, the crop. And that gave us this history down through 2016.
There we go.
That's better. Hope you're still back there. Okay, so at that point, we changed our method of accounting and we started working with Square to register sales. So what we were really keeping track of was sales as they happened rather than crop as it came in from the field. The difference is a little bit subtle, but if you start doing something which unintentionally drags on for 20 years, technology will change on you. So if you're going to do something somewhat consistent, try to keep track of where it goes astray and just how consistent it is. All those numbers were really kind of confusing and I wasn't making sense of it. So at a point a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, COVID came along and everything got upset. So I thought, what the heck, draw a chart. And here's my harvest history over the years. By 2004, these trees were about 10 years old. And between good years and bad years, everything was going up, but bad years kept rolling along just like everything else. And every year I would ask myself, and my wife would ask me, so where's the profit? I guess I'm here to answer that question, really. But let's take a look at the next page. So I saw this and I thought, okay, there's good years, bad years. How are we going to measure changes as we go by? And I rather arbitrarily drew some zones in here saying maybe the top 20% or so are good years. If I had that crop coming along every year, this would begin to look like it could be a business. And on the other end, if I got a half of a crop or less, maybe it looks like it's not going to be much of a business. But somewhere in between, there's this wonderful yellow zone where maybe things could happen. We'll come back to this color coding later, green, yellow, red, not real complicated. Okay, so what I want to do is focus on this beginning of the warm-up in the spring where we're accumulating a little warmth, and at the same time we have a threat of a frost coming along. frost being 28 degrees. And here's an example of what goes on with 1 year. I've been really fortunate to have this local weather station and their hourly and daily data. But gradually these growing degree days heat up, and at some point in here, the buds on the trees begin to swell. There's probably more to that story that we won't get into, but the growth isn't terribly well correlated with growing degree days as I've measured it here and seen it. But this is where the tree is really coming to life. And at some point in that season, there's the last killing frost that's going to come along for the season. So it's an opportunity to kill the most advanced growth that the tree has managed to produce for you. So wouldn't it be handy if we were just to do that for all 20 years and see the big story? Well, it's a little bit cluttered. But in fact, this is 20 years of experience showing you the way the spring warm-up happens for me, as well as when those last frosts occur. So at some point in here, I'm pretty sure there's issues with the crop that happens in the autumn, but the idea is to decipher the truth of the program. So I've erased all of those growing degree day lines and got it down to the last killing frost. And the question here is, what day of the year is that frost on? And how many growing degree days have accumulated, where mentally I'm thinking growing degree days is more or less telling me something about how much growth is happening on the trees. Is it those leaves that are going to freeze and kill up, or something less? So let's go ahead and pull out our box of crayons and color in the green and the yellow and the bad, the good, the bad, and the in-between. And I see something like this. I wasn't ready for that, you know. Anyway, I saw this, so I had to set it down for a couple of days thinking the picture's not right. So I came back and looked at it, and I realized I was expecting that there would be a line going horizontally where if there were more growing degree days, meaning more fresh green growth on the tree, a killing frost would be obvious because everything would be red and there would be no crop. And the story here doesn't seem to add up to that. Instead, what I imagine I'm seeing, and this is almost a test on you folks, I imagine I'm seeing everything to the right of this line is leading toward a bad outcome. No crop, poor crop, and somehow everything before that line, almost, is leading to a good crop. Why? And what the heck is going on down here where there's the occasional bad crop scattered in with a good crop? So let's take a look at the next slide and try to make some sense out of this. This is the best I can do in terms of interpreting what I've seen over the years. I was expecting that at a certain growing degree day number, I would see all red up here, all bad crops happening, and this would be good. There's something going wrong, and I suspect what's happening is that the tree knows something about the calendar that we're running on, and if frost happens after that date, it's affecting the crop that comes. If it's before that date, and the only data I have is what we see here, I can't tell you about the areas on the screen where there's nothing. But if it's before that date, there's a pretty good chance of a crop happening. And that really shook up my world a little bit. I wasn't ready for something so simple and straightforward as that, and had to process what was going on. So I think what we've got happening is that if the blossom period, which, like I said, was very regular, was in this part of the year, mid-June to mid-July, if a frost happened after a certain date, then it did something with the blossoming process that stopped an eventual good blossom and good crop from happening. If it happens before that date, then the blossom growth continues. And to go one step further, and this is the last step really in the presentation, I've got a couple of references down here talking about the development of chestnut blossoms from the first microscopic cellular divisions in these buds through a number of steps to the final receptive flower out in midsummer. And if you back up from the time you actually see a blossoming start to happen, it puts you into this general neighborhood. So there's some early point, I'm assuming, in the creation of the bud, the chestnut flower in the bud, where before that it's somewhat frost-proof. After that, frost becomes an issue and it will kill whatever's happening, whether it's in the bud or whether it's in the developing leaves. That's really, this is the extent of what I've seen and the first level of what I think is happening. There's room to ramble on beyond that, but I think that's probably a good stopping point. So let's see where we go from here. What I intend to do as a result of this is, suspecting that these later frosts are an issue for me, I'm going to come to my farm, which is this general setup. It's a field with a bit of a forested barrier going out to a large wetland area. I'm going to open up a superhighway for air to flow through on these cold, frosty nights, drain that cold air off the field, and hope that nature replaces that air with something warmer that gets me past these late frosts. The one other thing for me to do is keep an eye on the way these different trees are performing. This wasn't a work or no work thing. It was really a some work or some not work. And something is out there working and it's been producing a nut crop, even when I wasn't looking and when I was discouraged on some bad years. I just hadn't bothered to look and see where success was. So it's time to keep an eye out for that. And then what can anyone else do? If you're growing chestnuts out there and you can keep an eye on them and you occasionally perhaps have issues with frost, you can keep an eye on the trees and see if some of them are making their earliest growth, the swelling of the buds. Keep track of the killing frost, the 28 degree nights through the springtime, especially when the last one happens. And then try to understand how long it is from there until you get a hint of the chestnut blossoms really beginning to express themselves. And that's usually the catkins showing just a little white pollen production. And that's the chart that I produced here. That should begin to give you some clues for if the issue I'm seeing is in fact something that goes beyond my farm, and you might be seeing some variety or variation of that. That's probably about the end of that presentation. Here are the two references related to growing degree days, two references related to the flower development. The first reference I found about 15 years ago was this one. It might not be out there to be found nowadays. Some things on the internet just disappear. But it appears that this is something of a follow-on investigation showing detailed pictures of the blossom development and putting it on some time scale for a certain cultivar at a certain latitude, a certain location. May or may not apply to you and me, but it's probably close for some of us at least. Now, I think that's about the end of it.
Read the lights.
Oh, sure.
Are there any questions out there, right here?
Yeah, did you take into account the previous year's crop? Like, is it possible that all the crops are medium unless you have a bad crop and the next year is a great crop because the tree has more energy?
Did I take into consideration the year-to-year cropping? I did not.
Because It looked like you were going down, and then you'd have a record year right after a bad year, and then it kept doing that.
There's something people refer to as alternate year bearing. And after I looked at this chart, I realized that alternate bearing actually means even years or odd years. That's alternate year bearing. So I did look at that chart, looking at the even years and the odd years. And what I showed you gave a more distinct delineation between good and bad than the alternate year bearing. Now, I got friends that believe in alternate year bearing, so I got nothing bad to say about it, but this is worth considering.
I'm not saying alternate year, but I'm saying when you have frost damage or something and you lose your nut crop, the next year the tree's got more energy or makes more flower buds during that vegetative year, then the next year it might make more bigger nuts.
Yeah, I have not pursued that. I do want to point out that I divide my year into two parts, management and labor. January is management. February through December is labor. I'm a very small farm. So those.
Are you gonna be around later?
I will. I'll be around for the next couple of days.
Okay, he's gonna be around if anybody wants to ask questions later.